Welcome back to Secret Weapons. My name is Mark Johnston. If this is your first time here, this is a YouTube channel where we do gear demos and reviews, as well as studio tips and tricks for leveling up your writing, playing, and production from the perspective of a guitar player working out of a home studio. If that's the kind of thing that would appeal to you, I would love it if you hit that subscribe button and stick around for future videos. Today we're taking a look at the Beetronics Larva Morphing Phaser. This is a fun video to do because historically our coverage of Beetronics products falls into one of two categories. Typically, it's either a pretty straightforward overdrive or fuzz or dirt pedal of some kind that I typically rave about because they are very good at their dirt pedals, or it'll be a modulation device of some kind that gets so heady and esoteric that I end up making a hour-long video explaining how to work a particularly complicated chorus pedal. But today we're taking a look at something that actually kind of rides the line between those two categories for Beetronics, and that's because the Larva is a surprisingly straightforward phaser with some excellent qualifiers that makes it its own very unique device. And I say straightforward phaser because at its core, this is basically a two-knob phaser with a resonance control. You have rate and depth and a resonance. However, you might notice that there's way more knobs on here than those three. And that's because there are a few, like I said, qualifiers that make this really interesting. The big marquee one is going to be the word morphing in morphing phaser. And that's because you have rate and depth on each side. This is the same voiced phaser with two different sets of controls and the ability to morph or ramp between those two sets of parameters, allowing you to set a low and slow or a jittery and fast phaser, and then to either immediately jump to a different sound or very gradually morph between the two. The behavior of that morphing can be dialed in with a ramp speed control as well as a 3-position toggle that will give you access to a version of shuttling between those two sounds that can either be monodirectional, so basically press and hold that foot switch and you will go from phaser A to phaser B and it will stay there. A kind of round trip version of things where pressing and holding will take you from your current phaser to the alternate one, and at whatever point you let go, it will make the trip back at the same speed, or more of a sawtooth shape where you can ramp from one phaser to the other, and when you let go, it immediately snaps back to phaser number one. So already we obviously have a lot of kind of ways to modify the traditional sound of phaser to make it less predictable, but also very controllable. As you heard on that intro track, we did some interesting things with phaser speed and depth with that foot switch that gave us total control over what would otherwise feel very random in terms of modulating a modulation pedal. But you also have a couple of small knobs in the center right here. Your master volume, which is just the overall output of the pedal, as well as a preamp gain control, because this thing has a really excellent sounding preamplifier in it. This thing breaks up really well. All of the gain you heard on that intro track was the Larva running into our Victory amplification sheriff behind us, set pretty clean, like maybe the hair beyond edge of breakup. This thing was giving us all of our dirt, and it does dirt really well. So well, in fact, that there is one more toggle on this device over here that allows you to move between the functionality of this device as preamp, which is no phaser whatsoever, no modulation, just the preamp circuit itself as a drive pedal, a middle position where you have proper phaser, where you have your dry tone and the modulation running on top of it, giving us phasing, or a vibe kind of third position, which takes out that dry signal and gives you instead just the modulated sound, giving you vibrato instead of the kind of phaser modulation that comes by juxtaposing dry against wet signal. And that's it. This is mono. There is no MIDI. There is no kind of deep lore or esoteric wisdom behind this like some of the more ambitious Beetronics releases. It is just a surprisingly straightforward, really, really killer sounding phaser that just also happens to have a really kick-ass dirt pedal inside of it as well. So let's throw this thing back in front of our amplifier and let's give the Larva a listen. So as always, before we get into our sound samples, let's talk through our signal chain and the context we are working in. I am playing my Jennings Navigator with McNelly Steiger Swagger pickups into the Beetronics Larva, and then directly into our amplifier, which is the Victory Amplification Deputy, with a little bit of reverb going into the Universal Audio aux box running a California V30 style cabinet. We're recording into a pair of Maris 440 preamps, and then into our DAW, which is Universal Audio's Luna. We have our amp set pretty clean. This is what it sounds like. So I want to start things off by taking a look at the preamp circuit in this thing. Obviously in the back half of that intro song, we had a lot of gain going, and all of it was brought to us by the Larva. And even on that front half, you could hear a lot of touch responsiveness in those kind of like moments where you dig in a little bit harder with this circuit. So we're going to start by taking a look at the preamp circuit specifically in here. This rightmost toggle we have set in the left position, which is going to be preamp only, versus the middle position, which is your phaser, and the right position, which takes out your dry signal for a vibrato sound. We have both of these knobs at noon so that you get a little bit of added grit right off the jump. So let's go ahead and compare our clean tone to a both knobs at noon preamplifier sound. So as you can hear, you've got some good gain right off the jump. You can dial that back a little bit. But this thing can also get really screaming. If you take it all the way to minimum, it gets really anemic, and you basically have to kind of like crank your master to compensate. But like I said, I think a lot of the best sounds in here are master somewhere around noon and pushing that preamp to really create some good clipping. Yeah, there's a lot of good both volume and gain on tap here that will give you a lot of space to really blow up your amp like that, which is quite nice. That's the preamp. Let's go ahead and take a look at the actual phaser side of this device. So we've got our preamp set to something closer to like what we had on that intro track, the first half of it, which is that kind of very edge of breakup. Very touch responsive, which is really nice because as we step into the phaser side of things, the resonance control down here will help us kind of break up our amp a little bit more. So we're going to go ahead and play with the phaser, mostly looking at the left channel on this side because they are identical phaser sounds, just with the ability to morph between two sets of phasers. And as you just saw, anytime you make a change, it will jump to that phaser so you can hear what's being done, which is handy. But like I said, we are going to focus right now on this left phaser and the kind of like that as our kind of center point for taking a look at rate, depth, and that resonance control. And then we will take a look at the ramping system and the different shapes of ramping that this thing has as well. And let's go ahead and bring in that resonance control. And let's go ahead and take that wet signal out and hear it as a vibrato. And of course you can set the, let's go back to phaser mode, turn up that resonance a bit, and you can of course set two different kind of sounds on each side. So let's set on phaser number 1, let's set something slow but pretty kind of like deep. And on phaser number 2, let's shallow it out a bit but make it nice and kind of shivery. And then you have access to a couple different shapes as well as the speed at which you ramp between the two by pressing and holding this foot switch. This foot switch, for what it's worth, can also be used as a tap tempo for whichever phaser you are currently on, but it can also be pressed and held to morph between the two with an additional trick that we'll get to at the end. Shape number 1 is going to be directly across, just kind of like a shuttle from one position to the other. So when I press and hold, it will just morph across to the other side at the speed that this ramp sets it at. So obviously you can go much slower ramp speeds. Or much quicker ramp speeds. With the added benefit of, if you put it in the left position and hold ramp down, and take ramp all the way to minimum, it will actually function as an immediate jump to the other side, but will return to the spot you're on when you release it, like so. But with the added benefit of being immediate when you take that ramp to minimum in that left position. So you can basically have it so it goes. Or have it so it presses and holds to jump back and forth. Which is what I was doing on that intro track. The ability to kind of like immediately jump to that very shivery thing is pretty fun. Or you can have it do the exact same thing right here. So let's go ahead and hear it in a more kind of like interesting context. So left position is going to be across and stays. Let's set it nice and slow for these sound samples. Shape number 2 is it will ramp across but return when you let it go. And then journey back at the same rate. And shape number 3 is that journey out and then it zips back really quickly. So all of these things give you access to some really interesting ways of creatively moving between two predetermined sounds in this thing, which is really, really handy. Obviously, you can, of course, jump between phaser 1 and phaser 2 by just moving a knob. But when you are playing, you can also double tap the bypass switch to jump to the other one. So for things like the ramp away from and back to in positions 2 and 3, if you want to start from phaser number 2 and go to phaser number 1, that is a way to do that really easily as well. Some additional fun things to note about that ramping system is when that ramp is at minimum, you can think of these two as completely separate functions. So this will allow you to obviously treat each side as a preset, and this will allow you to kind of press and hold to jump back again, which is really handy as well. So by taking ramp to 0, tap tempo is disabled on this foot switch, but instead you have access to a immediate ramp to setting number 2, and or just kind of presetting between the two without the need of double tapping on this side. It's worth noting that there are some secondary controls in this device as well. By pressing and holding the right foot switch and adjusting rate number 2, you can set a separate subdivision for rate number 2 that can be thought of as a subdivision of rate 1. So this is a quarter note on this side. But by pressing and holding this side and twisting the knob, you can actually set a subdivision of rate number 1. So now when you jump between the two, this will now be a subdivision of this one as defined by the tap tempo, which is really handy. If you made it to the end of this video, I would love to know. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. I would love to know, what was the standout sound for Larva for you? Are you a phaser person? If not, why? If so, is this kind of in your wheelhouse? Or are there phasers out there that I have not covered on this channel that you think that I need to know about? Let me know in those comments down below, and I will see you in the next one.